Welcome everyone to our webinar tonight. We're doing a little kind of sneak preview of some of our new DIAD assessment data that we just got back this week. So my name is Noah Borton. I'm Senior Director of Educational Programs. I think I've met most of you at some point in our interfraternal travels and in our educational programs and whatnot. But for those of you I haven't met, work with fraternity on our educational programs, also work with all of our assessment stuff. So I can coordinate our assessment efforts with the DIAD assessment, which now we're in our 5th year of working with this organization or this company that has put together this assessment for us. And kind of just a little bit of quick backstory on this, and then we'll kind of start diving into what the data says this year. So, like I said, 5 years in, this came out of really a desire to understand, what is the impact of the experience. I think also as we've gotten into it, it's really provided some incredible insights into just kind of chapter culture and what's making an impact on the chapter level as well. And so, now that we are getting into kind of 2 full cycles of kind of 4-year membership that we have data on, we're really starting to get some good rich data to dig into, and we're really starting to dig into the impact of the membership experience, and really starting to look at what are the things that are having a positive impact, what are the areas where we're seeing growth, and what are the areas where we want to see more growth. So that we are in short getting to a point where we have a lot of data to play with, a lot of data to dig into on both the chapter level as well as the international organization level. So welcome Kathy, welcome Tony, good to see you both. In essence with this stuff, I think I could probably just start talking and go all night talking data, as some of you have probably experienced through some of our RLA chats and dual chats in the past, talking data till late in the night. But luckily for you all, we have a hard stop at 9 o'clock tonight because Carl needs to use the Zoom account, so he's going to kick me off at 9 p.m. So I won't be able to keep you all late into the night here. But let's go ahead and dive in on this. So, and just for clarity, in case anyone wasn't really involved in the data collection process, so all this data that we're talking about right now is data that we collected this year. So the survey launched end of January. We conducted data collection through January, February, and into March. We ended up cutting it off into March. We went we ended up going a little bit longer because certainly with all the disruptions to school, we gave some folks a little bit of extra time to get some of the survey completed and whatnot. But so we're looking at basically like February-ish as kind of a general snapshot as to when most of this data was collected and came in, late January into February and some March, right? So, and especially when we get into looking at some of the chapter level data, or when you all receive your reports and get your chapter level data, I think that's something you want to take into consideration as you're processing this and realize, like, well, what was happening in the chapter at this point that might help explain why some of these attitudes existed or why guys were having this experience, right? So I guess maybe first off, I know some people have probably heard that spiel 100 times, but I also don't want to leave folks in the dust if they haven't had a lot of experience in working with the survey. So any questions about just kind of like background on our data collection or on the survey or where any of this came from before we dive in here? Cool. All right. Hi, Gavin. Welcome. Let's see. I'll go ahead.
Hey, how are you?
Doing pretty good. All right, so now can folks see my screen? Excellent. So a couple of things to look at. Now, admittedly, I got this data like 72 hours ago, and we have not received our report back from Dyad, right? So they'll do like a full analysis for us and stuff. So we haven't done like any of the advanced testing or anything like this. This is just like literally like sneak peek. You know, this is just kind of an early preview for, you know, anyone who's willing to talk about nerdy data stuff with me for an hour. So, you know, some of this will be a little bit surface level in some of the analysis because we're not really getting in depth. But I think there's still some interesting things to look at, and also I think we can talk more. We'll talk more about kind of like what some of the next steps will be and what could be coming down the road. So I think a couple of things just right off the bat was looking at some of the demographics. I think you can see clearly this is based on the respondents, right? So this year we had 80% response rate, which was actually our highest response rate that we have had. We've been at like 78, 79 the last 4 years, and this year we got like, I think it was 80.1 or something like that. So actually, chapters did a great job of really coming through and driving the response rate. Clearly, there were some challenges there at the end as campuses started to shut down and whatnot, and guys were kind of scrambling to get home. And so, but I think you see that a little bit in the freshman response. Usually we have a little higher percentage of the sample being freshmen, but I think we probably captured a little bit smaller number of spring associate members likely. So, but you know, heavily sophomore, junior, and a few fifth years hanging on there, still filling out the survey for us. So we appreciate their dedication. That was probably Clayton. So a couple other things I pulled out that I thought were interesting. You know, the 80% response rate I mentioned, and again, part of why that's so important is that really provides a lot of confidence in the credibility of the data. You know, I think we can really feel good knowing that this is going to be a good representation of attitudes, beliefs, experiences of the membership, because it is such a high number of, or high percentage of the members of the organization that actually participated. So you can see like 10.7% of the respondents this year were legacies. That's actually a couple percent higher than the last couple of years. So thought that was interesting. And actually, if you extrapolate that out to, you know, the entire organization of, you know, close to 4,000 undergraduates, that's a good number of individuals who are legacies in the organization right now. 12.8% this year were first generation college students, so first person in their family to attend college, which I thought was just an interesting tidbit to throw out there. And 47% of guys had a job this year. So about half, and that is a little bit lower than what we saw last year. I think it was 53% last year, which is kind of interesting. And I think that'll be interesting to track some of that moving forward. And clearly, when we look at that next year, that'll be an indicator of you know, some of the economic impact of some of what we're seeing happen in the economy right now with the job market. So just a couple of little demographic tidbits that I pulled out there. Another one looked at kind of role in the chapters. We saw 35% of respondents were a general member. So basically I had, and this is asking for highest role that they've had in their memberships. 35% never had any kind of leadership role in the organization. 22% have had like a committee chair role, and 35% have had an executive board role. And this is self-reported. And then you'll also note, like, so 8% of individuals didn't respond to the question. So that's why that does not add up to 100 there. This is definitely an area, you know, that we want to keep an eye on and we want to work on. So like some of the testing we were doing last year and some of the analysis that we saw last year, and I think it's going to be interesting to see kind of how that plays out this year, was definitely indicating that kind of the more we were getting members involved in some of those smaller leadership roles, younger in their tenure within the fraternity, and then kind of advancing them into ongoing leadership roles throughout their membership, the more likely they were to show kind of higher levels of connection and better levels of brotherhood based on the brotherhood measures that we'll talk about here in a minute. And so I think, you know, trying to get more opportunities for people to have leadership experiences and trying to, you know, have more individuals in those committee chair roles and have those executive board opportunities instead of just have the general member experience, you know, might be one avenue that we can, you know, pursue to try to get guys more connected to the organization and try to give guys a better experience. So this is definitely one to keep an eye on here. Looking at residents, this was one that actually I hadn't looked at before, but Josh just gave me the data this week. So we have tracked this over the last 3 years. We just didn't have it to report out. So looked at just where guys currently reside. So you can see how that's played out over the last 3 years. So you can see this year, 31.3% of guys said that they're currently residing in the chapter house, 26.6% were currently residing in a dorm or residence hall on campus, 31.3% were in an apartment, and 2.8% with their family. The remainder either didn't answer or I guess other. And so you can see that, you know, it's fairly consistent, although interesting that in 2019, it looked like for some reason reporting, you know, fewer members living in the chapter house and more individuals in the dorm. So that might, in some regard, be indicative of maybe we had more freshmen or first year guys in the sample last year than this year. And a few more guys living in apartments last year than this year. But you know, something interesting to look at, and certainly interesting to think about. You know, when we're looking at just kind of the impact of different policies and programs across the organization, and also clearly recognizing that this is a national organization sample here, right? So this is definitely not going to be something that would be applicable to a chapter, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that 31.3% of Iowa State members are living in the chapter house. Yeah, oh yeah, Jeff, yes. So this is data for the entire organization right now. Yep. All right. So let's move forward here. Let's talk brotherhood for a minute. I'm going to take a minute and just do like a quick recap on our 4 measures of brotherhood and talk about where that data is looking this year, because this is kind of one of the core constructs of what we look at. And I know probably, especially sorry to like AJ and Gavin, you guys have probably heard me, and Clayton, you guys have heard me give this presentation like 5 times. So I guess if you want to jump in at any point and give the presentation for me, you can, and we'll test you. But I do think it's important to have kind of this foundational understanding of some of these core measures that we're looking at. So then we can talk about what it means, right? So yeah, so there's this brotherhood schema that Dyad's put together that provides a pretty good look at really the relationships within the organization, and kind of understanding that sort of the sum of those relationships really speaks to kind of the environment within the chapter, right? So getting at how is it the guys connect, how is it the guys establish brotherhood relationships with each other. So first measure is this idea of brotherhood solidarity. So kind of this idea of brotherhood described as brothers are there for one another and have one another's back, right? And so, you know, something that's important to recognize with this is there's sort of two sides to this this concept of brotherhood, right? So clearly, there is this idea that you need to have some aspect of brothers take care of one another, right? Because if you had no solidarity in a brotherhood, then kind of my joke is like, I hope you don't need a ride across campus, right? Because nobody's going to care. You know, you want to have a brotherhood where people care about each other, people will do things for one another, people will support each other in times of hardship. But this can also become exacerbated. So this is kind of my joke. I'll talk about it being sort of, this can also become kind of like the TFM brotherhood in some regard, where you'll see with groups that really get exacerbated or really high solidarity, you'll see that start to play out in more sort of extreme, kind of those stereotypical frat behaviors can become associated, and sometimes with more aggressive behaviors or probably more concerning risk-related behaviors that we'll see. And so that's why you're really looking for this idea of solidarity to be kind of in this sweet spot, kind of maybe in like the mid threes is what we're looking for, where, you know, that's where you can kind of find those altruistic aspects of solidarity, right? Kind of, you know, and this is where you get those stories of like, you know, a brother in need, brother had a family tragedy, and the whole brotherhood showed up to be there to help him out, right? I mean, even, you know, in times like these, what we've experienced the last 2 months, I mean, the stories of altruistic solidarity and guys being there for each other and taking care of each other are coming out every day, right? And that's valuable, and we need that. But you don't want it to get to a place where it's like playing out in those more extreme and perhaps aggressive behaviors, right? So you'll see our solidarity bumped up a little bit this year. We had been on kind of a downward trend the last 3 years. See, last year we were at 3.57. This year bumped back up to 2.65. Not sure exactly what to attribute that to. We are still well below the national average, and you'll see it certainly in comparison to some of our peer groups. We tend to be much lower on kind of the solidarity and the shared social, which I think we view as likely generally a positive thing. And so I think while we saw this tick up a little bit this year, another interesting aspect though went along with that, we had no chapters above a 4.0, and I think that's the first time that's happened in the 5 years that we've been doing the survey. And so I think, you know, even though overall is a little higher, you're actually seeing maybe more chapters in sort of that ideal range of what we're looking for, so that we have kind of that more ideal brotherhood environment, right? So I think that was a positive, and so I think this can be an interesting one to dig into a little more. So the next one is we had this idea of shared social. So really this is getting into essentially the idea of brotherhood established based on brothers have a good time and do fun things together, right? The time spent together engaging in shared social activities, spending time just, you know, doing, you know, essentially what it is that friends do together, right? And establishing a connection based on common interest and common time spent engaging in activity. And so I think, you know, this is clearly where you need to have some aspect of this, you know, you kind of the idea of like being in a fraternity should not suck, right? Like being in a fraternity should be an enjoyable experience, and you should want to spend time with your friends, right? And, I think sometimes you see chapter environments where maybe they do not want to spend time with their friends, and you see a very low shared social, and you can see like the guys just don't have an interest in that actual time connecting with each other, right? But of course, this is also on the flip side. When I missed my joke slide there, on the flip side, when you see the shared social become exacerbated or kind of played out to the extreme, then you can see the social connection really becoming the reason for the relationship, right? And so, you know, uh, I think you start to see that cause problems then within the chapter, and certainly within a fraternity environment. I think you see that tend to start to correlate with higher levels of alcohol use, higher emphasis on alcohol as a central factor in the social environment, and driving a lot of the connections among members, which then also really impacts the depth of relationships and depth of the connection. So, one of the ways I'll talk about this with folks as well is I think, it's not necessarily that, we don't have social connections in our lives, but also when we have some of those relationships that are of a purely social nature, then when we remove that social aspect, then there's no relationship left, right? If I've got my gym friends and we talk about the gym with each other and we hang out at the gym, and they're great and I love them and they're wonderful people. But if you remove the gym component from it, then, there may not necessarily be a relationship that persists, right? And so in thinking about that fraternity relationship, we want to have more than just a social connection there. Right? So that's where we want to see this be a good, enjoyable connection, and guys have time spent together, but without it becoming the driving central factor for the relationship. So you can see this again, essentially, bumped up a tiny bit, essentially the same from 3.82 to 3.84. And this had gone down a little bit in the last couple of years. And so it's really, we're kind of seeing that shared social remain pretty flat for us. You can see the national average is a 3.94. So we're a little under that. Again, that ideal range here is kind of a 3.3 to a 3.8. I think a couple of interesting tidbits on this one. We had no chapters below a 3, which I think is a positive, which actually I think it's been a while since we haven't had any chapters under a 3. And I think clearly when you see that, that's kind of a red flag of, kind of maybe these guys are, not enjoying their brotherhood experience with each other, right? I think an interesting aspect of this one that we're looking at, actually, Kathy, you might find this one interesting, but the last probably 3 or 4 years with sororities, there's been a really strong upward trajectory on this, and much more emphasis being placed, I think, on the shared social sisterhood connection. And that seems to be playing out just across the board with all the different sororities that are involved, or that are doing the assessment. And there have been some fraternities that have been going up, but we have not been having that experience, right? So it's been interesting to see how that's kind of playing out differently for the men's organizations than for the women's organizations right now. And, I guess anyone's guess as to why that is, but certainly that's been prompting a lot of conversation. I think just another thing to think about here is, this is probably an area that's likely to look substantially different in the coming year, as since we have taken this assessment, the entire concept of shared social interaction has had a substantial upheaval and disruption, and we don't really know, how that's going to be playing out in the fall at this point. So I think, clearly the idea of continuing to maintain social connection and continuing to provide engagement for our membership is going to be a priority moving forward. And so that's where you've seen some of the things like last week's webinar on the kind of virtual Brotherhood activities, and really looking at even how like experiences in membership development programming and even chapter meeting programming and things like that can be kind of adapted to try to continue to deliver some sort of social connection and social experience within current environment, so that we don't lose this aspect of the Brotherhood connection here. So it'll be interesting, certainly, to see how this develops in the coming year, and obviously certainly an important area to emphasize. I got a little shout out for you here, Kevin. Threw one in there for you, buddy. So the third area is belonging. With this one, this is the idea of, described as my brothers value and appreciate me, kind of the idea of like my brothers know who I am and love me because of that, right? Like I'm welcome here, kind of the sense of home away from home. So clearly this is also a pretty valuable measure to be looking at in the coming year as well. And what we find with belonging is this has been kind of one of our key priorities, as this seems to be linked to a lot of measures that we want to drive within the organization. If we're able to kind of move belonging in the right direction, then we see other things to go in the right direction as well. And and starts to make sense. If I feel like I'm valued, appreciated, cared for by the people around me, then that's probably going to make me a better contributor, and I'm going to feel just more welcome, more like this is something I want to be a part of, this is something I want to contribute to, and probably something that I'm going to have more enjoyment being in as well. So belonging is certainly something we want to emphasize. Skip slide here. So we did see, so we're essentially even this year, which I guess is probably not what we would have hoped to see. We've been ticking upward a little bit, so we've gone up about half a point since we started the survey, which is good because this has been a priority area, as I've mentioned, and I think anybody who's attended our educational programs or has probably had a Building Better Men retreat or anything, knows that we're really having a lot of conversations around this concept of belonging and creating a brotherhood environment that is welcoming and brings people in and makes people feel like they have a home and like they're valued and appreciated and accepted. And so, we want to see that continue to grow and continue to go up. So, went down 0.01, which, it's not necessarily a substantial decrease, but so essentially pretty flat this year after we've seen things kind of tick up a little bit for a few years. And you can see the national average here on this one is a 4.32. So we have consistently been a little bit below the national average, which has, we've been kind of a little bit better on the solidarity and the shared social, and we've been kind of a little bit lower on the national average on the belonging and the accountability that we'll talk about here in a minute. So a couple of things with this one on the chapter level. We're looking at kind of ideally, we would like to see kind of a 4.3 or above on this one. Our highest chapter this year at a 4.65, which is very high. So those guys feel very much like they belong. And we did have 4 more chapters this year above a 4.3 than last year. So even though we were kind of flat, we did see more groups above that 4.3 marker. So that is something that is a positive sign on the chapter level. Just trying to throw a couple of quotes in here on a couple of these. I did some focus groups with a couple of chapters and really pulled out some great stuff and some things that really kind of spoke to the type of brotherhood that we're talking about and measuring, and looking at some things that we want to do to try to really reinforce practices that develop this type of belonging and accountability in a chapter. And so I heard one individual said everyone has their own issues going on with them, personal or back home. You have people here who are here for you. I'm always happy when I'm here, right? So I thought that was just kind of a really great example of showing someone speaking about their experience and without even knowing it, really kind of highlighting this concept of belonging and talking about how that chapter had really created this environment where he felt like he belonged. So then the last one here is accountability. And so this is kind of the idea of the brotherhood best described as my brothers make me a better man by holding me to high standards. So we look at our newest group at Colorado here doing their retreat and making their standards for membership and their core covenant. So this is the idea of a brotherhood connection built around like my brothers, make me a better person, right? My brothers challenge me to become better than who I am. And I think, and that can play out in sort of that more formal setting of kind of, the rules, the accountability processes, but I think in much larger degree, it plays out in more of an informal setting of kind of the guys just calling each other out, holding each other up to expectations of who they should be, how they should act. And even on the flip side, I think, what they should strive for, and kind of the idea of like, you're going to go for this because I know you can accomplish this. I know that you can achieve more than you think you can achieve, right? So accountability really plays into that on both aspects of that. And we really see that drive, that connection as well. And so again, with accountability, really want to kind of shooting for that 4.3 and above. We did see a little tick down this year down to a 4.25. So that's not necessarily something that we want to see in that national average. So we're looking at a 4.39, so a little bit below. So I think in our follow-up conversations, thinking about how we're establishing accountability and talking about standards and expectations, starting through the recruitment process and into the associate member process, and then really creating that idea of culture of accountability within the chapter is definitely going to be something that we're going to have on the radar this year. And so I think this will definitely be a priority area to be talking about this year. And the highest chapter this year was a 4.56. So we did have a couple of chapters that were up there pretty high on the accountability measure. And I think another quote that I thought was pretty interesting on this one, I would say, wanting and facilitating in the success of others, not the traditional definition of success, if you got this job or whatever, but you help their moral and social development, help the various aspects of their lives that help them have a successful life, right? So that was just kind of a quote of a guy talking about really what brotherhood meant to him. And I thought that was really a pretty insightful comment that really spoke to this concept of accountability. So just real quick, and as you're looking at it on the chapter level, really kind of this ideal pattern, we're looking at wanting to kind of see this vertical or trajectory here. So from solidarity to a little bit higher shared social to kind of belonging and a little bit in that 4.3 range, and then accountability a little bit higher than that. When you see that relationship, that creates kind of this good balance among the four measures, which we see really resulting in kind of the ideal brotherhood pattern, and just generally likely then seems to be most indicative of kind of a healthy brotherhood environment that's creating a good positive experience for the members, right? So and we can come back and talk about questions on that in a minute. A couple more data points I want to run through really quick as well. We had some really good movement on some measures related to just kind of commitment and how guys are connecting with the organizations. So we have this measure of affective commitment. This is kind of the idea of like, commitment based on like love of the fraternity, right? Like I remain a member of DU because I love the organization, right? I have that strong sense of affect and care and emotional connection to the organization. And So you can see we were last year slightly above average. This is one that's kind of been a little bit up and down, but has tended to be a little bit lower around the national average. This year we took a big jump up to 4.16, which is pretty interesting. Not necessarily exactly sure what is behind that, but I think, you know, that's certainly a positive for us and showing that, you know, guys are feeling connected, and feeling like they have more of an emotional connection to their organization. And then on normative commitment, this is the other commitment measure we look at. This is the idea of like commitment based on I have a sense of obligation, you know, so like I have made this commitment, I have said I'm going to do this, so I am going to maintain that commitment to the fraternity, right? And so this one has tended to also be a little bit lower. It ticked up a little bit last year and got a little bit above the national average there. But this year it took a big jump up to 3.95, which is well above the national average, which is great to see. And I think, you know, also, you know, important to see, you know, in our current environment, you know, when guys are being pulled away from campus and, you know, a lot of strain is being placed on our chapters. I think also it's encouraging to see that, you know, we've got that strong foundation of that commitment that's been built up within the organization, and hopefully that is speaking to some of the successes that we see some of the undergraduate chapters doing and maintaining some of that connection. And so hopefully we'll be able to see this commitment measure persist throughout the year, but I think that's an encouraging sign of something that we would hope will help in weathering the storm here. And kind of a related measure here, this organizational identification. This is one we've been focusing on and wanting to try to improve. So you can see last year was 3.96, well below average, but we did bump up to a 4.07, which is good to see. And this idea of organizational identification, this is sort of like, it's almost like a measure of pride in the organization. It's sort of idea of like the degree to which somebody sort of incorporates that the fraternity into kind of their personal sense of identity, kind of, you know, it's a part of who I am, a part of what I'm about. I think we'll kind of joke around sometimes when talking about this that like every chapter has that guy that like never leaves the house without at least like 2 pieces of clothing that say DU, you know, and buys every single t-shirt and is first on the list for everything. Like that is your high org ID guy, right? You know, the guy who is the walking banner for the fraternity, right? And so, you know, and that's clearly kind of an external representation, which is not the only way to show that sort of sense of pride in the organization. But certainly you'll see that I think organizational identification can be one measure of just looking at how guys are thinking about the membership and how guys are connected. And so I think, you know, certainly hopefully encouraging to see that go up as well. And, you know, we'll keep working on catching that national average. I don't know what we're going to do to get there. I'm trying to think what those Beta and Fiji just have like astronomical org ID scores. They're just like killing me on this one. So gotta figure out how to catch them on that one. All right, let's see, go back. One more thing to mention, then we can talk through some questions and talk about any specific things you all want to dig into. But so thinking about next steps. So clearly I'm just kind of giving like a few little tidbits to think about based on what we have, you know, looked at in the first like 2 days of having this data available to us. We're going to do some real deep dives in this in the next 2 months, and we'll have a lot more to report out on later, and you'll see a lot more coming out about this. We'll probably have some follow-up webinars on this as well. But we'll also be putting out our chapter reports again. And so you see, here's an example of what a chapter report has looked like in the last few years. And so we have kind of the Brotherhood scale up here for every chapter to show your the relationship and the pattern of your different Brotherhood scales will provide sort of some strengths here. What are a few areas where the chapter scored really well? What are some areas maybe where the chapter did not score as well, where the chapter could, could be an area for improvement? And I think when you're looking at those, also always encourage, don't necessarily think of that as bad, think of that as an area for improvement. As even, for some of them, a chapter might still be performing well in that area, but, if a chapter is performing well in pretty much every area, then, it's kind of the area where they're performing least well becomes the area for improvement, right? And then also included some areas of the greatest change, what are a few variables that changed the most from last year to this year. And then we'll provide a little bit of analysis and also some recommendations on some things to implement in the chapter to help out with some of those areas for improvement. And so that's kind of what the report has looked like. So also so I'll be working on those and over the next month or so and providing those for folks. We will see, what is the date that I was told to write down? So we will have all of these done and distributed to chapters by August 1st. And we will also have this packaged along with the Men of Merit Standards report. So essentially we'll be able to provide this as kind of an assessment look and looking at environmental look, as well as looking at some of the membership outcomes for the chapter. And then we'll also have kind of that operational look and the evaluation with the Men of Merit Standards. So hopefully that'll provide a lot of good data for you in terms of looking at where the chapter is as you're making your plans for heading into the fall, right? Also, a couple other things want to let folks know about, make folks aware of is certainly if anybody would like to have a follow-up after this and do maybe a little more extensive dive into some of your chapters individual data, would certainly be happy to set up an individual call with advisors or chapter president, or even would be happy to Skype into a meeting or whatnot. And especially after we get the reports out, we'll be offering it up to any chapter that would like to do a virtual coaching session, with even Zoom in for an executive board meeting or something, and kind of walk through the report and kind of talk about what some areas for improvement might be, what some interventions might be that we want to implement, and talk about some action plans and whatnot, and talk about a plan for follow-up on that. So definitely don't want this to be something where we just dump it and you kind of look at it and throw it in the corner. And definitely want this to be something where you feel like you can get some help and support and get your questions answered there. Yes, so yes, Casey, I think I answered your question. Let's see here. So, but actually, a question I had for you all was, in thinking about those chapter reports, we've had quite a bit of consistency with those the last few years. So I think a number of you have, chewed on those reports before. So as long as I have everyone captive on the line here, would certainly love to ask if you have any thoughts on things you would like to see in a chapter report, or are there things that would be helpful for you for me to include, or ways to communicate the data that would be helpful for you?
Yeah. I know in our chapter reports, in the past, it just kind of shows the data for that year.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be more helpful to show kind of how our chapter has progressed over the past few years in certain areas. So that could potentially be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, actually, along that point, I think now that we have 5 years of data, it'd be good on a chapter report to see, senior class, see their progression over the 4 years, 3 years for the juniors, so you can see how that starts to track. And again, now that we have this data set, it'd be great to start seeing how we can enter controls so we can truly measure the value of the educational programs or of the experience versus outside noise. Because I know I've looked at our data for the last 3 years or so, and there's just drastic up and downs that happen.
Yeah.
So it's how do we phase out what the value of the chapter is versus, okay, this year X happened, or the chapter size went from 60 guys to 100 guys or something like that. I mean, just wondering what controls we can start to build into the data so we can actually get some analysis out of it.
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, or good thought. Something we chew on a lot. I think we are starting to do some more testing to drill down a little bit more. We have found some ways we can break it down by class for the chapter. And it's like an analysis like that, I think, is kind of a lot to put in like the regular chapter report. Because on some of this, it's like I'm gonna like just overwhelm people with numbers, but certainly available for some additional follow-up and conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I just think at least for the senior class, I think it would show, it'd be you could kind of keep it like as the next bar level down, and you wouldn't have to go in a lot of detail, but you could actually see the shifts of here's what 4 years did, 1 year at a time at the report level, kind of a thing.
Yeah, so try to get some analysis. Well, so I think so something we are looking at trying to do over the summer, kind of Noah's summer project, I guess. I mentioned that we've been doing some of these focus groups. I think we'll probably continue some of that work and just trying to get some qualitative perspective to add to this. But ultimately what we're trying to build to is we want to start to identify some chapters that would be interested in being some pilot chapters to implement some kind of specific targeted interventions based on their data. So we would say like, all right, let's do a deep dive on your data, start of the year based on, what the data is saying. We think, here are like your 5 priorities and here are like the 3 action items for each priority that we want to implement. And then we're going to evaluate those or assess those after the fact and see if we made progress, right? And actually start to try to dial into exactly what you're talking about, Andrew, get into like actually what is moving the needle, not just that the needle is moving, right? And so I think definitely looking for groups that would be interested in being pilot chapters for us in the next year and starting to test out some different kind of chapter operations and educational opportunities and be willing to help us in kind of measuring some of the efficacy of some of those things. And also Dave, so yes, the reports will be available by August 1st for advisors, but certainly if you all wanted to get together and do a Zoom call sometime before that, I'd be happy to sit down and go through the data with you.
Noah has worked with us from time to time, and we've done a multiple year analysis. And fortunately, we have Dr. Cody as a faculty advisor who can do a lot of the analysis. But what we've found that when the demographics of the chapter change, it skews your numbers from year to year. And the analysis is going to be for next year is going to be really interesting with closing down halfway through the semester and how the chapter is having to adapt to its social interaction.
If I could hop in, Noah, I just had a suggestion for the question of noise in the data.
Yeah.
Noah, as you know, I do crunch a lot of these numbers that I get. So if you're interested, if anyone here is interested in trying to determine, where your sources of noise may be, I would recommend getting your years of assessment data and throwing it in Excel and trying to find correlation between variables. So you can find correlation between shared social and chapter size, or correlation between Brotherhood belonging and number of brother events or something like that. And while that's definitely not a causal relationship, you can't be certain. I found some really interesting things in my data just by looking at what correlates with what. So for example, when I have a larger chapter, our shared social is higher, but when our chapter gets smaller, our shared social is lower, and the correlation value for that relationship is pretty high. So if you want some more back of the napkin type stuff and you know how to use Excel or Google Sheets, I think that finding correlation coefficients and seeing what that means for your chapter is a very good place to start.
Yeah, no, it's a great insight. Yeah, I mean,
When I get the data from NOAA, it will be interesting to correlate because we made a change in the chapter and what they did as far as programming and the direction of the programming this past year. And I'd like to see if that has an effect on the numbers when we crunch those. I suspect that it will, but it'll be interesting to see how it comes out. And if that's the case, then when we meet with the officers again at the start of the fall, I think that's the analysis needs to move forward and say, these are the things you need to address in the chapter going forward.
Yeah. Well, super sneak preview, Dave. Your belonging went up a lot, which is really good because it was really bad. But also your shared social went up a lot and is now really high. So apparently guys are having a much more social experience now. But they like each other.
The other thing I'll tack on is if any chapter officer here, advisor is thinking about it, my chapter has had a lot of success starting to write annual reports. And it's daunting to get the first one off the ground, but once you do, you sort of have a template for the future. So I can go look back 3 years and see how my chapter has changed and have like narrative commentary on how that's happened. So if any officer here or advisor has had that thought in the past, but might have backed off for whatever reason, it's really helped my chapter a lot. And it's basically a chapter history for incoming officers and advisors at this point.
Yeah, you guys have done some really good work there and providing kind of some of your own analysis along with some of your sort of internal chapter surveys that you guys do about what guys are looking for and what guys are thinking in the chapter. And so it definitely provides some good context around this data. Let's see, I've got time for one more question. If anybody else has one question, if anybody has a question or anything.
Yeah, I actually got one. In regards to like the averages that are supplied on like the sheets and like the national ranks and DU ranks.
Yep.
Is there any way to like become more specific with that data and maybe have it be like national average for chapter sizes 80 to 100, national average for chapter size 60 to 80 or something like that? Or does that data not really exist? Because I feel that chapter size can really determine what difference is in a lot of those things.
Maybe. Let me think on that.
Okay.
Noah, is there a lot more data in the database that we don't factor into our analysis that out of the national averages?
Well, so what'll be in the actual report will be, 8, 10 variables out of like 30, 35 that we actually measure, right? So I don't provide every chapter with every data point because I think, again, not wanting to just overwhelm folks with just here's a whole bunch of data. But we do have those additional measures available to share and discuss with chapters. And we have the stuff I've provided for you, Dave, is the stuff that essentially we have to look at, kind of minus the demographic data that isn't included in there.
No, are national averages just fraternities, and are they other just other national fraternities that Dyad Strategies does this with?
Yeah, so it's fraternity members, and it is from both their national organization clients as well as fraternity members who take it from their campus clients. So they do have campuses that will take it. I think there's probably more members taking it from the national organizations. National organizations seem to be a lot better at getting their guys to take it than campuses do. So it's definitely skewed more toward national organization. But where that's good is that gives us a full national spread. And it's getting to the point now where it's a pretty sizable database, so it gives us a pretty good comparison. So with that, Hayden is texting me and telling me it's time for him to have a meeting. So I very much appreciate you all joining me for this conversation. And time flies when you're talking about statistics. But again, just scratching the surface with this, I know, but hopefully at least I'll be able to provide a few tidbits of a couple of new information points. AJ, I'll think on that question, and we can talk about that more down the road here and try to figure something out. But really appreciate you all joining me, and certainly would be happy to follow up with anyone if anybody wants to dive deeper on any of this. All right, so thank you very much, and everyone have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Noah.
Thank you, Noah. Be